Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, and it is now a course at NYU and an elective towards the journalism certificate. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, author of Writing That Gets Noticed. And I'm so happy to have Lisa Cooper Ellison with us on the program today. And I want to tell you a little bit about Lisa. She's an author, speaker, trauma-informed writing coach, and host of the wonderful Writing Your Resilience podcast. She works and writes at the intersection of storytelling and healing, and combines her personal experiences with suicide loss and CPTSD with her clinical training to help writers turn tough experiences into art. Her essays and stories have appeared on Risk and in the New York Times, HuffPost, Hippocampus Literary Magazine, and Kenyon Review Online, among others. Welcome, Lisa, to the program. And I see a little friend here.
Yes, this is Foxy.
Fox.
Say hello, Foxy. She is my co-pilot in most things in life. And I have found that if I close the door, she will scratch at the door and meow and make all kinds of noise.
Cats, I think they don't even need the distinction. They're just automatically emotional support animals to me.
They are. They are. It's funny. Foxy is not just a great comfort to me, but there are so many times when I'm working with a client and they're dealing with a really tough topic, and she will know. She can't hear anything because I have my headphones in. She will know, and she will come up and she will purr into the microphone. And it suddenly changes everything. And they're like, I love your cat.
That is beautiful. And I have been a huge cat lover my whole life. They're sort of my familiars. And I had Percy, an orange cat, for 17 years.
Oh
and
my gosh.
He was my guy. He was the most beloved. I can't believe he's gone. So this is a perfect segue to the topics that you cover,
Yes.
Lisa. I mean, you help writers write their most traumatic, their most difficult, their most painful experiences. And not only that, but you use your background to help coach them through the emotional trauma and the emotional effects of what they are dealing with before and then after they put it on the page. Can you speak a little bit about your background and how you came to that realization that this was a great way for you to use your abilities and background?
Yeah, so I have an EDS in clinical mental health counseling, and I always thought I was going to work as a trauma counselor, and I did for a period of time. But what was interesting is the universe had a different idea of what I should be doing. And illness ended up being the vehicle that got me where I am today. So I got my degree in clinical mental health counseling, and not long after that, I was bitten by a tick and I got Lyme disease. And I got very, very sick. And I continued to work as a therapist because, I just put 3 years of my life into this and I had done really well. And after you graduate, you have 2,000 hours in the state of Virginia that you have to get in order to become licensed. And I didn't want to take time off and heard all these scary stories about, how debilitating Lyme disease can be and what can happen. And I was like, it's not happening to me, except it was happening to me. So finally, I got to this place where I had to quit. And I was so sick. My husband was looking at this job out in Portland. And I remember sitting on this couch in this hotel room in Portland. And I was pretty sure I was going to die. My liver was starting to shut down. I had all kinds of things happening. And I had always wanted to be a writer. I had always wanted to help other writers. And I had been writing my whole life, and I had been editing on the side for years. So this wasn't something that just was an idea that popped in my head and I just said, oh, I'm going to do this thing I'd never done before. I had been working for a long time in this area. I just didn't feel like I was good enough. And I also felt like I had to do the safe thing, which counseling felt safe because it's a very concrete career. Do this thing, you're going to have this result, which you and I both know is not the case with writing in any respect. But I just got really clear about what I needed to do, and I needed to pursue my writing. And as I was healing and I would bargain with the powers that be, I was just really clear that if I were to get well, I would help support others, like that I would pay this forward. And it all came together to allow me to do this. And I think having this writing background, studying writing for many years, working with writers in a variety of different ways, and then having this clinical background was this beautiful marriage that when I was sick, I wouldn't have thought could come together.
I have to say it's a niche and you occupy it really well. And I think it's important because there are so many writing teachers out there. And, I think having that identifying characteristic, it not only sets you apart, it sets your experience apart. So people know what they're getting in you. Like, for example, for me, very few writing teachers have had a career in magazines in the editorial world as a magazine editor-in-chief as I have. And so that experience is something I bring to my teaching, just like you bring your coaching to your teaching. There's so many things that you mentioned that I want to discuss with you. And I want to also preface this by saying, Lisa and I met several years ago, maybe it was 2016, at the Hippocamp, which Hippocampus Literary Magazine would have a conference every year. And we both were speakers at the conference, right? And Lisa was so nice. She said to me, why don't we have breakfast one morning? I didn't really have deep connections that were there at the time, even though I was speaking. And I just thought it was so kind and generous of you to offer to have breakfast with me. And so it was really nice to connect with you there. And also a shout out, Linda Lowen saw me and she talked to me. She said, I see you from social media and you look exactly like you do there. And so we formed a friendship as well. And I really liked seeing how you went and connected with the people who were attending your session. It was really special and it showed the kind of teacher and writer that you are.
My heart is full as you say this. And I'm remembering that breakfast as well. And I remember going like, holy cow, I can't believe this amazing woman that I am having breakfast with, who seriously, I was thinking that the whole time, like, oh, can't believe she said yes, because you do so much and you have so much knowledge. And I was just so honored to get to know you more. And it was a delight to see you at AWP last year. So it's been just wonderful to connect with you. And I just want to thank you for all you do. Your book is amazing. It's such a great resource. Seriously, it is. If you don't have a copy, you need to buy a copy, everyone. And, your podcast is great. You have such great guests. And every time I listen, I'm like writing down all these things, these little tidbits.
That is so meaningful to me. And thank you so much, Lisa. And so I want to go back to focusing on you because you have so much to offer in terms of helping people navigate these traumatic moments that they want to write about. And what have you seen in terms of getting past that. I mean, there's writer's block, and then there's writer's
Mhm.
block for
Yes.
writing about your trauma. And I completely understand that, because although I haven't had some of the trauma that the people you work with have, I had an ectopic pregnancy that took a long time to write about. I had other relationship issues before I got married that took me a long time to write about. So I understand about this. It's really hard to make yourself vulnerable on the page. So what do you
Yes.
suggest, and how do you work with your students to do that?
So I want to step back for a second and talk about what happens in the nervous system and how that impacts people. You know, there are so many women in particular who are drawn to the memoir space because they've gotten to this place in their life where they're ready to tell the truth. They have a story that they just feel compelled to write. And there's a specific reason why you feel compelled to write these kinds of stories. And that's because something is unintegrated inside you. There is a question that is not yet answered, and there's a story that's not yet built around your experience. So you don't know what it means, right? You might have a lot of feelings around it, but you don't know what it means. And so writing can be this huge medium to help with that. And I can say, especially when I was sick, writing is one of the things that helped me get well. So the nervous system is one of the reasons why we get called to this work. However, when we're writing, especially if you're writing in scene, and if you don't know what that means, I'm talking about writing that is cinematic, as if you are there. It is like reliving from the nervous system's perspective, because the nervous system does not know the difference between memory and reality, right? The neurons fire in the exact same way. And so there are many people, and I was one of them, right? So I'm raising my hand here, who came to this and they thought, I've done my work. I have gone to therapy. I know what this means. I just have to write it down. And then they start doing it, and it's so much harder. So that can be one of the big issues. So the issue is, how do we support the nervous system so that we stay grounded and we stay a little more in our heads than in our hearts? Because the heart is what gets us in trouble sometimes. We get, when I say the heart is the part that is experiencing all these emotions, right? And we
Yes.
have to be tactical as a writer. So we want to be able to engage both, and keeping yourself grounded is one way to do that. And then really focusing on the meaning making process.
I love that. And, for me, when I was writing about my ectopic pregnancy, it was so emotional to me that I would
Yeah.
cry every time I would read it. And I
Mm.
wrote a lot, and then it was really not coming together. It wasn't gelling. And I just stepped away for 6 months. And then
Yeah.
one day I woke up, I had enough distance. I went
Mm-hmm.
back, and my editing part of the brain was on. And I was like, boom, 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 boom. And I put it together and submitted it to it. It ran in Purple Clover, but I retained the rights. Always retain the rights if you can.
Yes.
And it won a Blog Her Voice of the Year award. And I was really proud of that story, because that I had to go through such
Mm-hmm.
an emotional kind of roller coaster to get to the point where I was able to tell my story. And what do you say to people who are struggling not only to write their story, but then in the writing of the story, they're worried about what the effects will be once it's out in the
Yeah.
world, because that's an important element of what then happens. And I always tell my students, when you unleash something out into the
Mm-hmm.
world, be prepared for what will be unleashed back at you.
Yes, I'm glad you brought this up, because I almost want to apologize on behalf of all of us, because I think that there is this false promise that gets sold a lot. And I'll be the first one to say there have been times when I've sold this, and that is the promise that if you write about something and you publish it, you will feel better. That it's going to heal you, it's going to fix your self esteem issues, it's going to change all of these things. And a lot of this is based on the research that James Pennebaker did around writing to heal. But all of his research was around expressive writing, and it was writing that was just for the writer, for the purpose of healing. So when you're writing for the public, you are doing something different. You are writing to an external audience. And I would say for trauma survivors, there's two parts to the puzzle. So there's the one part that's about you. And for many people, if you've experienced trauma, trauma happens when our pain is not seen or we are seen in a very negative light. Something bad happens to us when we're seen. So that can make the process of being seen feel really terrifying. And it can evoke a tremendous terror, even when you know, like, I have written this well, but I have been vulnerable. And it's that fear of being seen and having your vulnerability seen, like where the armor's not there, that can be so hard for people. And what happens when, like, our unconscious knows this, or perhaps we've had this experience in the past, we procrastinate, we get so far, then we have to revise again, or there are all these different things that we do, and we need to just get really clear on what will make this safe. So that's the piece that's about us, and the things that help make this work safe is knowing your point and making sure that the work is fully cooked, meaning you understand what the story is and that you have told it in such a way that whatever you're sharing out in the world, you feel that adult you can truly own, that you are compassionate to whoever you're writing about, even if you're sharing, bad behavior, that you know the context for it, you know how it fits, and that you've done that work. So when you do that, it helps to center you.
Yeah.
And then there's the part that's about how other people respond. So I don't know if you have anything to say before I get to that, but I wanted to give you a chance to speak.
No, I mean, I think like one of the things I do as a writing coach is I try to protect my students from their own worst
Yeah.
inclinations. I'm going to give you an example. And I had written a piece for brevity about it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't blow up your life for a byline. Because
Yes.
during the pandemic, I had students say, oh, I'm breaking the rules and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And,
Mm-hmm.
it might be illegal, but I want to write about it. And I'm saying, don't do that. Everybody's
Yes.
on a high alert right now. It's not regular times, and you're
Mm-hmm.
going to piss off people and somebody's going to do something. Or somebody said, I know later Mina Dubin wrote about mom rage, but I had a student who wanted to write about mom rage. The only difference, and I would have said fine, the only difference was she was in the middle of a divorce at the time.
Yeah.
And I said, do not write about how you are angry and want to do something to your kids, because that will be used against you in a court of
Yes.
law. And there's this impetus towards, oh, just tell your story, tell your worst thing, confess
Mm-hmm.
everything. And no, part of this is how I look at it anyway, part of our role is to protect the people that come under our guidance. So if somebody's going to write something, yes, you can write about, loss, you can write about grief, but it has to have some deeper resonance, some
Yes.
universal, not just this sad. I once had an editor say to me from the New York Times, I have a lot of people sending in to me saying this sad thing happened to me. And that's
Mm-hmm.
fine and good, but it's not enough. It's just not enough. I
Yes.
wrote about my dad who has Alzheimer's, and I know you have a parent who has dementia and
Mm-hmm.
Alzheimer's. And it's back when I could get him to kind of really connect with me. I did it through singing. And so that was my hook,
Mm-hmm.
singing my dad back to me. And it wasn't just my dad has Alzheimer's, here's the sad story of my
Exactly.
dad and me. But I want to talk about, you have written something recently that has a lot of emotional implication for you
Mm-hmm.
and for your reader. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I'm going to speak to that in a second. I want to back up and just
Back
verify
up.
some of the things
Yes.
that you said is yeah, you have to really think about what are the ramifications out there for you in terms of, could you experience any legal issues? Could you have pushback in your relationships with family members that you don't want to have? I actually had a whole conversation with someone from my newsletter following who asked me a question on my podcast, who was worried about, they wanted to tell their truth and their children didn't want them to. And the question I ask is, which is more important? Telling your truth out in the world, like in a public way. Like, you can tell your truth, anything on the page, right? Put anything you want on the page. Not all of it belongs out in the world. And I think when we had this conversation, she realized, my relationships with my daughters are so important to me. This one piece that they are really upset about I can take out, and I
Yes.
can still own my truth. So I think it's really important to think about how all of this is going to play out, because once you put things out there, as you've just said, you cannot take it back,
No.
and it is not yours anymore. People are going to make their own meaning from it. So you have to know what your meaning is, and you have to do what I call keeping your side of the street clean, which is really understanding, what is it about? Have I explored how this is going to impact my relationships? Have I figured out what I'm willing to own in
Yes.
terms of the consequences? Because there's always consequences when we write. And so when I was thinking about this piece that I wrote, and this is to me how I know a piece is ready or it needs to be written, is I will have this almost like a volcano experience. We talked before on my podcast about how you're a volcano writer. I will have this thing that says, write this. And it feels like heat rushing through me, like it's time. And whenever I do that, and then I pitch it, it gets published. So I've learned, listen to that feeling. And this is a piece about emotional flashbacks. So if you don't know what an emotional flashback, a lot of times people will talk about flashbacks in terms of PTSD, and it's where something happens out in the world and then it triggers this visual image in your mind of something that happened to you in the past, and then you have a lot of feelings about it. Well, with emotional flashbacks, there is some sort of trigger, but there's no memory attached to it. It's just you have these really powerful feelings and you don't understand why, and it can make people feel like absolute failures, and just like they don't know how to cope with life. And as a person who has complex PTSD, and if you don't know what that is a form of PTSD that comes from having a lot of trauma in childhood. So it's a rewiring of the nervous system that happens due to childhood trauma. This is something I have dealt with for a long time, and I had a lot of shame around it. And I had to get to a place in my life where I was ready to tell that story, that I had done enough of my own work to say, you know what? I know how to cope with shame. And I know that I know enough about this experience to educate the reader and to write something that is of service to others, and also is speaking my truth, and is sharing what needs to be shared, for everyone, for myself and everyone else. And so I knew that it was time, but I still had to think about, okay, which meltdown in my life is one I'm willing to own? And I thought about it in two ways. I thought about which moment is important for me to talk about, that I feel okay talking about, but also there are a lot of things I feel okay talking about that might be too much for a reader, because I know this is the type of topic that people are going to be thinking about their own experiences, that it could take them into their own emotions. And I don't want to write something that is intentionally triggering someone else by sharing high trauma, right? This is one of the ways that I work as a trauma informed person. I'm thinking about not just my nervous system, but your nervous system as the reader. And that doesn't mean I shy away from topics, but I'm mindful of what I'm sharing. So I shared this moment where I was new to graduate school, and I was at the time still I had a lot of anxiety, and I wanted to impress my professors because I got this coveted assistantship. It was paying for my whole schooling. Not a lot of people got that. And I wanted to do a great job. And I was older than most of the people. So I wanted to prove that I was competent. And I sent this email. And in the email, I typed there THEIR when I meant THEY apostrophe RE. The homonyms,
Yeah.
right? I just made a homonym error that is very common. People do it all the time. Then I hit send, and then I realized I couldn't take it back. And I had this absolute meltdown, which I write about in this essay, around this thing that a part of my brain knew wasn't a big deal, but my nervous system could not stop having that experience. So that's what I'm sharing. And so I wanted to take people through that experience of anxiety, but I wanted to do it in a grounded enough way that I could take them deep into a moment without it being something truly awful.
I'm going to link in the show notes, and it's absolutely fantastic because so many people are going to benefit from this article and have benefited from this article. And when you're talking about that, it makes me think of something that brings me emotion right away: music.
Yeah.
I
Hmm.
can be watching a TV program and they'll be like, and now we're doing songs from the 80s. And they'll play
Yes.
something. I'll be like, and I'm like, oh my God, it just reminds me there's a song all by myself. Another one would bring back something with an old boyfriend. And it's almost like a smell will take you to that
Yes.
time too. Like if I would smell Ginette or, something Bombell, that would bring me back to that time when I was growing up. And so I think that's really resonant because you don't always know what the emotions are that something is bringing out in you. And I also want to segue talking about music.
Hmm.
You are working on your own memoir, and I
Yes.
would like you to talk a little bit about that and some of the themes that are informing it.
Yeah. So this is a memoir about how I forgave myself and learned to live in the aftermath of my brother's death by suicide. So, what I've really come to understand about this book, when you're writing about grief in particular, because so many people write about grief, it's a universal. We're all going to lose someone at some time, though our experiences of grief are all different. For me, this experience was an awakening. And one of the vehicles of the awakening is that my husband at the time was on this heavy metal tour. He was a heavy metal musician. I was this heavy metal chick. I was also this incredibly nerdy, shy, introverted kid, but also these other things. And I end up on this tour that goes into Yugoslavia when they're trying to overthrow Milosevic. And I save this puppy and I meet this person and we make this pact to live. And this is a huge piece of it. And then it's like, okay, you've made this promise. Well, how do you do that? And in order to do that, there were all of these things that I had to confront about myself and also about how I was more like my brother than I realized. So, I had left home when I was 17 and I had this whole story about who I was as, the high performer who got it right and got out. And yet I was also struggling with suicidal ideation. And that was something that I tried to push down for a long time because I didn't want that to be true. But the reality is it was true. And I think a big piece of that was that I suppressed so many of my emotions that, when whatever you suppress or repress becomes stronger, right? They say that in, whatever you resist persists.
Yes.
And that's very true in your emotional landscape. And so I had just pushed so many things down and growing up did not have the coping skills because the people who raised me also did not have the coping skills. All of that came together in this storm of my brother's death and I had to figure out my way out. And you know, I had to learn how to forgive myself, but also how to choose myself. And so
Oh,
that's the journey that I went on. And so that's what I write about and also sharing information about, complex PTSD and some of the other things mental health wise that people go through and how do people get in these situations. I think one of the things that happens, and I always share this, my brother died in the middle of a mental health crisis that was very public. It was on the front page of the news and it involved a hostage who he thankfully let go. And
mm,
so when things like this happen, and they happen a lot now, I consider my family lucky in the fact that my brother was very mentally ill at that moment, that he did let that person go. But there are so many people who don't. And then we have all of these tragedies that happen, and families that go through that are looked down upon. What's wrong with you? How did you cause this? And it's a lot more complicated than people realize.
wow.
And when these things happen, the family is a victim too.
Definitely. Even the person who leaves, I mean, they're leaving it. And it's
Yeah,
almost like an act of anger towards the people that are
right.
left behind because they have to deal with the fallout from
Yeah.
everything. What are some of the challenges? You're putting your trauma on the page, which is what you coach other people to do. And through your fantastic podcast, which you started just this year and which is doing wonderfully, and you have terrific guests. And I'm going to put a link to your episodes. And we also share a fabulous producer, Haley.
Yes, we do.
So I would say that you're probably dealing, because you have so much in your background. What are you finding the most challenging putting your trauma on paper?
One thing that I would say is that just because I know all of this stuff about how the nervous system works or how to help other people doesn't mean that I don't experience the same things. So when I go into that material, I have to be really careful about my own mental health. And, there is no way to write about difficult things without feeling something. And the more difficult it is, the more you're going to feel. So you have to make sure that you have the time, not just to do the writing, but to support yourself, because that writing is expending energy. And so your energy is going to come from somewhere, and you have to decide, is it going to come from your relationships and your health and maybe your work performance, or is it going to come from you being intentional and supporting yourself and doing good self-care? So I think making time for all of that in a busy life is challenging. And then there are a couple of pieces of my own trauma, which I am working through right now. And so I'm not going to talk about the exact incidents, but there are some things that have been getting in my way, and I haven't had good access to them. So I work with a somatic processing person. And I'm sharing this for people because just having a therapist that you can tell the story to for most people is not enough. You have to do the work that gets into the body, and a highly skilled, trauma informed, whatever. And that could be yoga, somatic processing, EMDR practitioner. There are a lot of different modalities that people practice that can help get to these deeper places, because the issue has been, I have known that this thing exists forever, but I have not had access to it. That's how it's been very guarded. So working through that takes a lot of energy. And I have to balance working on my projects and my ego, which says, get this out here now, with being gentle with myself, which says, if you really want to feel good about it, not just get it out there, right? Because I know a lot of people who drive from ego, and believe me, I've done it before in my life. They get their books out there, and then a lot of times they think, okay, if I do this thing, my self-esteem is going to go up and I'm going to feel whole and all of these things. And maybe they have a good experience, but a lot of people don't. And it's because they didn't do the inner work. So I think that's one of the things that I am balancing at this exact moment, is this last, I don't want to say last vestige, but it's the onion is small at this point, in terms of the onion of healing, and we peel back the layers. There aren't a lot of layers left to peel back that are, in this high trauma category, but there are still some. And I just have to do that work.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. And the grounding piece, I think, is so important.
Yeah.
And I think just sharing a little bit about myself, I was raised to not appear to be vulnerable. And what that created in me was a grandiosity, a brittleness that was off-putting, especially earlier in my life, before I had years of therapy and understood it, and still had to deal with it at times. It's sort of a go-to when I'm afraid.
Yeah.
But realizing that and being vulnerable in some ways, where it started was really through my writing,
Yeah.
telling those vulnerable stories. And I'm working on a memoir now, and it is so slow going that you have no idea, but it's a lot of stuff that is coming to the surface that I am structuring and putting in its right place. And it's not the same as just writing an article. I could do that with my eyes closed and my hands tied behind my back because I've done it for so long. But this emotional work is the harder
Yeah.
thing. and dealing with childhood and traumas. And I was a very different person then than I am today, but yet that little girl, that little Estelle, that nerdy person is still very much a part of me, and probably a part that spurs my energy, ambition, creativity, and all that, and wanting to help others and inspire others while also protecting myself, right?
Yeah.
You have to have both. So I wanted to ask you, because you are a venerable writing teacher, you do writing workshops for Jane Friedman, who's a guest on my program and is so wonderful. And I've known her for years through ASJA and Writer's Digest and all the things that she's touched on and made such an impact in the community. And I wanted to ask you, because a big focus of my podcast is like actionable writing tips. So
Yeah.
for you, what makes a compelling story when somebody's telling it? What are some of your like top 3 tips about writing that you can share?
Yeah. And so I think what makes something compelling is going to be in the eye of the beholder, or I'll say the eye of the reader. For me, what hooks me is something that makes me feel and also brings me deeply into scene. So I actually love stories that are journeys. You know, that's my go-to. But I also like things like Jenny Lawson's book, Horribly Funny, it's hilarious. And so I think there are a lot of things that can make it good, but I think good writing on the line level, so sentences that are really strong, but something that has a clear question. And so I'm going to talk for a second about Tia Leving's book, A Well-Trained Wife. And I want to talk about that because it's a fabulous book. And I'm so proud of Tia because Tia worked her tail off and she is just getting all kinds of great press around this book. I had the privilege of working with her on this, and that relates to these actionable tips.
And vice
And
versa. She had the privilege of working with you.
yes, yeah, we were a great team on that. And so one thing that's really important is to understand your essential question, and that can take some time to figure out. So, what question am I answering with this piece? And I think her book is great for instructing on this because the title is A Well-Trained Wife: My Escape from Christian Patriarchy. So the question is embedded in the title. How did you escape from Christian patriarchy? So when you know what your question is, and the question, if you're early in the process, right? So you're working on something right now. And what I always tell people is the early drafts of a memoir are for you. You are bearing witness to your experience. You're understanding what happened. So what happened to me is the first question. Then there's going to be a question that you ask that's for yourself. And then you have a question that is for the readers. And so that's for her readers. And Amy Lynn's book Hereafter has a different question. What does early traumatic grief look like? And what is the container for it? That's the question that she used, that she helped her write her book, which has a very different structure. That is a micro memoir that is very nonlinear, but the container and the question is clear. The other thing I tell people is that a beat sheet is your BFF. If you don't know what that is, a beat sheet is a screenwriting tool. The most famous version is the version Blake Schneider talks about in his book, Save the Cat. I also a great fan of Save the Cat Writes the Novel by Jessica Brody. That's because she expands it out into novel form because there are some nuances. But here's the reason why this is good for you. If you're writing a memoir, like that what happened to me part, like this is sad, right? You were talking about that one essay submission, this is sad, or this is what happened to me, see it. It can be so compelling, but when you use a beat sheet, you begin to see your life as a journey, and it's an easy way to give something shape. And there are actually great mental health benefits. Hidden Brain had a recent podcast episode on the benefits of seeing your life as a journey. And so I've seen so many writers shift their experience from just understanding that beat sheet. And if we pull back further, I'm gonna have taught on this by the time this podcast episode comes out, but it is something I'm teaching for Jane Friedman, is that okay, once you know those your beats, you understand what the arc is of your book and that narrative. So the question is going to help you understand the narrative arc. The beat sheet's going to help you understand how the plot works to support the arc. And then you have your scenes. And each scene is going to share the story. But what is important is going to be dependent on where it shows up in your book. So learning how to slant it so that's like, okay, this is the catalyst. This is about the invitation. I don't need to give every single detail of like the terrible things that happened. What are the details that invited me on the journey? That's the piece I need to focus on. And that each point in your book is going to have a different focus. And so when you are able to think in these ways, especially with memoir, it helps you stay in your head rather than always just being in your heart. And that is how you can edit in a strategic way.
I love that. This is such great advice. Lisa, I could talk to you all day long. We are
Same.
out of time, but oh my gosh, thank you so much for being my guest and for sharing all this wonderful information. And I can't wait to read your memoir when it comes out. And you will have to come back and be a guest again on my program.
I would absolutely love that. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.